Good morning, and to some of you, good evening. We're streaming live from Jama Software Studio, and we're grateful you could join us today for our inaugural deep dive. Most of our customers are building life critical software and systems and hardware, so we understand the importance of validating software like Jama Connect. We plan to discuss how we test Connect prior to release, as well as share pointers for creating your own tests. My name is Christina King, and I manage Jama Software's technical support team. And with me today are a few people from customer care as well as engineering. So we have Michael Cowan, he's a QA technical lead. We have Emerald Rustler, he is a technical account manager, and Chloe Elliott, who is a community manager. You can expect to hear more from her in future programming as she's injecting some new life into the community and taking over the reins that some of you saw that I used to have when you joined me in webinars. So before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping things. First off, this is our first time live streaming on YouTube, so please bear with us if we run into any technical difficulties, and feel free to comment if you can't hear us or if things look a little funny. We appreciate that. Second, if you're not there already, we'd like to point you to the community where you should join the discussion thread to submit questions to us. Chloe's moderating the session today, and it's going to be broken down into 5 sections. Michael's going to be taking us through the highlights of version 1 of his white paper, and we'll welcome questions throughout the presentation, for which we've planned some breaks in between sections to cover them. And lastly, Emerald is here to highlight our Enterprise Elite and Essentials programs. And throughout this webinar, you will hear some abbreviations and acronyms, and don't hesitate to ask for clarification if you missed what they meant. For example, you may hear us throw around the terms JVK and FSK, which stand for JAMA Validation Kit and Functional Safety Kit. 2 add-on products we offer for compliance with safety regulations. So please post your questions into the community thread as they come to mind. No need to wait until the breaks. And you can ask us anything. If we don't have time to answer them right now during this webinar, or the resources for that matter, we'll follow up with you on that thread. And so now I'd like to give the reins over to Michael. Go ahead, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. So I'm Michael Cowan. I'm the QA tech lead here at Jama. Like she said, we're kind of rolling out a new performance white paper. I'm going to give you a deep dive into that. You can always follow up on the resources on the web. To start with, I like to tell people a little bit about Jama QA, how we do Jama, how we do QA here at Jama. And your clicker is not clicking. Yeah, small technical difficulty. There we go. Cool. So to start with, we have a hybrid approach where we have QA both on the teams and then a follow-up QA we call QA/QC. So on the teams, we have 4 to 5 feature teams running at any one time at Jama. So that's 3 to 5 developers, a product manager, and then quality assurance. So the team is really responsible for producing quality on the feature that they're developing, whether that's bug fixes or adding new functionality or refactoring functionality. So that's where the majority of the QA effort happens. We do have QA/QC, which stands for Quality Assurance, Quality Control, and that's what I'm in charge of. And we kind of look at the entire system. So we do the full regression before each release. We run all of our functional tests, all of our performance tests. We work with an outsourced group where we go through and test all the browsers and everything like that. We do our functional automation, so we use Selenium and Java. And that's where we also do our performance testing. So we use a tool called Gatling, and we run through all the performance tests. We trend them release to release. And then finally, we package all that up into the Jama Validation Kit. So that's something we provide to some of our enterprise customers. You can talk to your account manager about how to get that. But it's really a package of, for compliance or certification, all of our practices, all the test results, and everything we do internally. So then, that all comes together. Actually, were there any questions about that on the forum? Anyone want to go deeper into what we're doing, or what we do for regression or anything like that?
No questions yet.
Okay. Yeah, if you have any questions, I think there's a little bit of a delay, so just come back and I'll catch them up. So how do we actually do performance testing, which is the focus of this? We do release baselines. So the best way of thinking about that is every release, we ensure that the performance hasn't degraded. So it's either improved, and if there needs to be a degradation for some data integrity, we'll actually follow up and tell the community through the JVK, like, hey, creating items is slowed down like 10%. Actually, since 2015, we've done pretty good of increasing performance, each release or holding it to a baseline. And the way we do that kind of sort of baseline is we test our endpoints. So all of our REST endpoints, we execute each one of them in isolation, and we measure the results. And then we do that in what we call steps and runs. So it starts off with like 10 users. We run all the tests 5 times, make sure that the results are comparable. Then we step up to 30 users, run the test 5 times. We step up to 60 users, run the test 5 times, and then finally 120 users, and run the test 5 times. And the reason we do that is to ensure that there's no like anomalies in the data, so that we can validate it. And then we just compare that performance, like I said, release to release. You got to click on the thing. Okay, so new features, architecture changes. This is a big thing. So if we're refactoring like how we do our caching, or if we're adding new features, we'll actually go in and have the team start first, and they'll do custom test creation, they'll do record and playback, and throwaway scripts. So custom test creation is really knowing what the team was working on. They'll build tests specific for that one release, and then we'll take the cream of those tests and we'll put them into the regression and carry them forward. The record and playback, that's just a way for the team to build things really quickly and run them. Imagine that you're getting 2 or 3 releases a day on the team, so they can have scripts they record and play back. They don't last very long, so we call them kind of throwaway scripts. And really the idea is to put a lot of energy, a lot of effort on that new feature. And then finally, we have like a QA lab. So we manage QA, our own lab. We have both for hosted and our self-hosted and our cloud. We have all of our OS and database variants. So all the OSs that we support, like MySQL, 2006 SQL Server, 2014 SQL Server on the database side. And then finally, we have a master data set. So that's a data set with like 1 million items in it, and it has a lot of learnings from our various customers who have shared like obfuscated data with us, and we've built that to kind of mimic a lot of our customers' data. And then daily runs. So we take all of that and we run it through. Each day. So all the performance tests are executed. We triage the results every day. So if a team made a change to like a database stored procedure or a query, we'll know right away that was impacted. And then finally, we have all of our KPI endpoints. So anything that's doing curation, anything that's like getting projects, we trend those out on a big dashboard that's up on some TVs. So you can see, and that shows like the last month, day to day. So you can see any trends, if we're starting to trend up or starting to trend down. So Chloe, any questions from the community yet?
Yes, I have a question, Michael. Can you say more about record and playback and throwaway scripts?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Record and playback. Jama is a complicated application to build long-running tests, but record and playback gives us the ability, like if you know the data and the data is not changing, we can reset the data. You can just keep some of the IDs. So imagine that you're on a team, you're getting a build, and you just want to ensure that items are created correctly, and you're not really maintaining the data integrity. You just want to record that happening through the UI and then play it back. And then, like I said before, those are kind of throwaway. So you can't use record and playback to build long-running tests that you would keep version to version, because things change, IDs change. But the teams can just record some of their work, some of their testing, and just play it back several times. It's just a technique to help the teams go faster. As we add like a new feature, I said we kind of swarm on it. There's a lot of testing that happens when something's new. And then when we move to the regression, we have more scripted, solid tests that we use to do trends and baselines.
Looks like we're good to go, Michael.
Okay, cool. So one of the questions I get asked a lot as a lead is, do I need to write my own tests? So I'm a customer of Jama. You've done all this testing. Do I need to write, test myself? And really, it comes down to something you and your account manager should discuss. Um, if you have non-standard data, so we obviously are testing what we know, um, and what we think are, most customers have. But if you have a project that might have more than 50,000 items or has unique data structure, if you've made customizations of databases, so we have customers who have put triggers in the database. If you have something that's non-standard, you're going to want to ensure and validate that as you consume the next release of Jama, it's not causing a problem. If you have very heavy usage loads, so we call them like peaks. So imagine that you have like a planning day or a training, once every month or so, and you put 100 people into a room and you're training them on Jama. That might be something that you want to verify that is going to work with your mostly self-hosted environments. Um, if you have heavy usage of baselines and reviews, so we don't we don't expect people to be having baselining every day and doing baseline compares. But if that's part of your workflow, that would be something to ensure that that continues to work for yourself. There's a lot of things on the slide, like custom API integrations, heavy report usage. So like if you're generating reports that have thousands and thousands of items, and then if you're really hammering one section like test center or reviews, and that's the main usage of Jama, you might want to create your own test. Again, making that decision, you want to talk to your account manager. We do have resources with the JVK and the FSK, so you can see what we're doing. You can see if maybe you only need to build a little testing on the side. So you take what we've done and then you add something to it, or you just accept what we've done. Anything yet, Chloe?
Yes, Michael, we have a question from the community. When talking about performance, let's see, hold on a second. Let me just read through the question really quick. How does Jama perform usability tests to increase the performance? Equals time a user needs to fulfill a certain task.
Okay, so yeah, most of our performance testing is focused on deltas. So the question is, how do we measure performance? I'm thinking you're saying usability is like workflows. So if you're measuring performance over a workflow, so how do we make sure that someone's doing something through the UI and that that workflow hasn't changed? Excuse me. So we don't really look at it that way. We basically look at it from if Jama's working for you today, we're ensuring that when you upgrade, Jama's going to have the same performance. And so we do that through the baselining of the REST endpoints because they touch all of the backend logic, they touch all the database logic. And so if we see any changes there, then we know to go deeper and say, okay, well, the create item endpoint has gone slower. Let's look at all the places that that's called from the UI. And so then we'll go through and do more testing. But with the baseline approach, if the numbers remain constant over all the API endpoints, we have high degree of confidence that it hasn't changed. Testing usability through Jama is a little bit difficult because Jama is such a configurable and complex project. People have different ways of creating items. You can create items by right-clicking the tree. You can add related items, through the drop-down off of the single item edit view. There's a lot of ways to build stuff, and people use Jama in vastly different ways. So what we're trying to do is capture the essence of performance at a technical level, and then roll that up to customers and let them know, like, hey, these areas have gotten slower this release, and we'll fix it or not going forward.
Yes, Michael, one more question. What are the downsides to writing your own scripts?
Yeah, so the downsides of writing your own scripts are it's an investment. It's hard. So Jama is a fairly complex application that does a lot of different things. Um, and I have a slide that talks more about some tips on writing your tests. So I'll go into that a little bit later. But the main thing is just a cost. And so sometimes when I get called in on a customer call to kind of review what they're building, or like why are their numbers not coming back right, they're just the investment needs to be made up front to build the scripts correctly, understand your workflows, and then just work through some of the issues of coding out performance tests.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay. So yeah, like I mentioned, I'm going to give you some tips for writing your own tests. So, we kind of talked about what Jama QA does, what we provide in the JBK. We've talked about, maybe you're going to talk to your account manager and see if you're a candidate for writing your own tests. So you've made the decision to make the investment. The first thing you need to remember, Jama is not a static website. So if you have, someone who's done automation or performance testing before, you really want to ensure that they understand what rich web applications are with a lot of dynamic calls. It's not just recording pages being loaded and then loading those same pages with hundreds of users. Each user has a different workflow, and Jama for data integrity prevents users from working on the same item. So if you had one user create an item and you recorded that and played it back with 100 users, 99 of those users are going to fail because you can't make the same item on top of the same place. You can't edit the same item 100 users at the same time because Jama locks it. So record and playback, unless you really know what you're doing, is just not very effective. And that's the main tool that a lot of customers start with when they want to start building performance tests. They record, and Jama does hundreds and hundreds of actions as it's loading up its UI, as it's getting data back and parsing it out. And so we have like a very heavy reliance on DWR, which is kind of a old school Ajax, which means the page doesn't load all the data. So the page loads up, and then the tree loads up, and then when the tree loads up, it has context, which loads the list view, which has context, which gets all of the synced items, the related items. So there's just a lot of stuff that's happening. If you think about it, create an item in Jama is 20 individual DWR calls to create an item. So it's checking permissions, it's checking the tree, it's locking the item, it's making the edit, unlocking the item when it's done. There's just a lot of stuff that happens. And the workflows are complex. So the IDs, you have to parse the IDs. So when you're making a call, a performance call, you go say, hey, I'm going to go to this folder. Give me the folder ID. I'm going to create the item. Give me the item ID. I'm going to edit the item. Use that ID. So these chains pass a lot of IDs back and forth. And then we have a lot of internal IDs, so like progress IDs and unique IDs that are used to stamp the calls. So just being aware of that, tests have to be very well scripted. It's not as easy as just recording and playing back. So our tip for that is to focus on REST. REST is much easier to script. We have good documentation for our REST calls. So we have something called Swagger. We have an SDK that's published on dev.jamasoftware.com. If you talk to your account manager, your technical account manager, they can point you to some of those resources. They're easy to isolate so that you don't have to run them in chains. So you can isolate each endpoint. It's industry standard. If you were hiring someone or you have someone on staff, chances are they know what REST is and they know how to automate it. And you want to avoid the DWR. So if you actually were to look at how Jama makes network traffic, it really focuses on DWR from the UI, but it's super complicated, and it's not something that we support customers doing, so there is no documentation provided for it. The payloads are very complex. They're not like nice JSON objects. They're very complex. The full Java object is encoded and passed along in the payload, so it can be a little overwhelming. And then, like I said, they typically chain multiple calls. So one REST call to item create or 20 DWR calls to create an item. And I put at least initially because you might have certain cases where you want to test a UI workflow. But what we found internally is the REST is good enough because the REST calls exercise all of the same background business logic, all of the jobs, all of the relationships, all of the database queries. They're all hit by the REST, the same ones that the DWR uses. So now that you're kind of picking your language and picking your thing, the next thing that can trip someone up is, not spreading their test out realistically. Like I said, Jama cares about data integrity, and there's a lot of workflow that is enforced. So users can't edit the same item. You'll get an error if you try to do that. If a lot of users are moving things around in the tree, you're going to get errors because as the items are being moved by one user, they can't be modified by another user. Now, in reality, that doesn't happen very often in production. So it's very seldom that someone would try to move an item in the tree and then they get a message that says, hey, this item's in use, try again later. That very seldom happens because the moves are fast. But with performance testing, you're cramming a lot of activity into a very short window. And so when that happens, your chance of those conflicts are much higher. And because the rest is coming back and giving you like a 409 conflict error, if you haven't accounted for that in your test, it's going to look like a failure. But it's not a failure. It's just the way that Jama's protecting itself. So really, as you're building out your tests that do writes, creates, moves, deletes in the same area, you want to make them realistic. You want to spread those users apart so they're not tromping on each other, and you don't want to create a whole bunch of them. And then if you just think about how Jama's used, look at yourself or your users as they're going through. They're not creating a lot of data at the same time. The biggest use of Jama is reads. So you're loading up a filter, you're looking at items, you're reading items, you're loading the tree, you're changing projects, and then you might create one item, every few minutes or in a folder. And a lot of workflows like create item 1, create item 2, create item 3, or maybe you're a developer and you're editing an item, but you're not having hundreds of people at the same second doing that. So just make your test realistic and you'll have less conflicts. And so that really comes back to understanding like the most expensive operation in Jama is when you are reordering and moving data. So unlike maybe like a content management system or unlike a tree in a operating system, the relationship of children, so you have the tree hierarchy where you have a parent and you have a child. And most trees, you don't care about the order of the children. Jama does. So Jama has a global sort order. We use that when you have the reading view to show items in order. So reordering is an expensive thing, and every item has relationships. It has sync items. There's just a lot that's happening there. So if you were to go and create 30 users who all start moving items around in the same tree, you're going to run into conflicts. Another thing I've seen is people, they might only have 50 licenses, but they want to simulate what happens if 100 users or 500 users. Jama has a licensing protection. If one user's doing an operation and he logs in on another browser, or in this case, another thread in your performance test, it logs out, removes a session for the previously logged in one. So because these operations are very fast, you'll get randomly, you'll get like 400 or 401 errors that are unauthorized. And you'll say, hey, I'm getting all these errors when I ramp my load up. And that's because your users are stepping on each other and taking away their permissions. So the best advice for testing is one virtual user has a license, and you're not sharing those licenses. So you're not sharing login information on multiple threads. So that was a lot of information. We'll take a quick stop here and see if there's any questions that have popped up.
Yes, Michael, we have a question. First question, is spreading out users realistic? If my users can click all the buttons at the same time, shouldn't I test that?
Yeah, so that's a question I hear a lot. So, is spreading out users realistic? I have 100 licenses. Can't 100 people go and click on the same button at the same time in Jama? And yes, that could happen. But what would happen in production is if 100 users, tried to edit the same item, 99 of them are going to get the error that, hey, user number 1 is editing this item. If 100 users went and started reordering the tree, some of them are going to get errors that say, hey, the tree's in use. That's not the value. There's no value in that when you're doing your performance testing. Typically, you're trying to make a business decision. Should we upgrade Jama? Should we take the next version and bring that into our production box? Is it going to affect our users? And the way to do that is to have good tests with good separation. If you're just testing what happens if a bunch of people, push a button, you can do that, but it's not going to be valuable information on whether or not you should upgrade Jama. Jama is built to recover, so if you did have hundreds of users who overload the system will slow down. Some users will be blocked, and then eventually, once the system catches up with all the requests, they'll start queuing and taking more. And we test that internally. We test bringing Jama down through either denial of service or creating 100 reports at the same time and making sure that it recovers. But it's not valuable data for most customers.
Yes, one more question. Is testing the REST endpoints good enough? Don't I need to do everything the UI? Don't I need to test everything the UI is doing to prove performance works?
Yeah, so I get asked that a lot. Like, oh, you're testing mostly through REST, but I don't see a lot of REST calls when I look at the traffic on the UI. And kind of like what I alluded to before, even internally, we have access to the code and the developers. Scripting the DWR is very difficult. A lot of that is dynamically generated, so it changes release to release. The payloads, the objects, the packages, they need to be hand built. And it's just, if you think about it, it's like dynamically generated web pages. Well, this is dynamically generated, JavaScript methods that are going back and forth. Difficult to do. So we've worked with our developers. We've looked at how REST works, and REST exercises all the same code paths and all the same data paths. It is not the same. So saying, oh, it takes 1 second for item creation through REST is not the same as what it would take in the UI. But again, in the UI, you have a lot more. The users are running slower. They're clicking things slower. They're not filling out all the fields within like half a millisecond and then submitting. They're taking their time to type things in. So yeah, there is a delta on that. It's not the same. But like I said before, the way we do performance is we compare release to release. So if the business logic layer and the database layer are performing the same on release, 835 as they are on 834, as they were on 833, we have confidence if your users are not experiencing problems now with Jama, they're not going to experience problems with the next version.
We're good to go.
All right, awesome. So this is our last section. So we've talked about like what we do. We can show you what we do. You've decided to build your own test, and you've taken the tips. You've invested in it. You've put people on it. Now comes the hard part. You've done all this work, but how do you measure the results? And really, what I tell people is you have to have a goal in mind, because you can just do all this work, and it's interesting to see what Jama does, and like, oh, it's cool. I can automate building items. I can do all these things. But the goal of performance testing from the customer perspective, in most cases, is are we safe to take this into our next version? Can we bring this into our production? Maybe we're jumping 5 versions. Did anything big change? And the way to do that is to compare a baseline. So you have a baseline, you run all the same tests on version that you have now, and then you take an early version of Jama and you run all the same tests in your test lab, and then you compare the results. The biggest thing that trips people up is not understanding the impact errors have on the results. So not necessarily in the performance, because errors actually make the performance either go better or they're easy to resolve, but they're going to skew your baselines. So if you write your test where they have a lot of conflicts, they're going to have conflicts in different places each time you run the test. So it's going to change the dynamics of the test. It's going to change the timings of the test. It's either going to make the test look longer or shorter when it's really not. 401 unauthorized errors means that you're reusing users and your tests are like locking each other out. And imagine that you've got a CRUD test, create, read, update, delete of items. So you create an item, you update the item, you read it, then you delete the item. Well, if you're getting errors on the update section, you're not able to do the read or the delete because the IDs weren't passed through, or maybe the deletes aren't working, and now you have more items stacked in the list. That's going to change the dynamics of your test. 503s are the errors you're really looking for. So if you are ramping up your testing, once you start seeing 503s, that means the system is not able to process any more data. So you're sending too many requests, and so it's basically telling the API, hey, we weren't even able to queue this because we're stacked. So what I do is I run my test up to the point where I get 503s and I back off a little bit. If you have no errors in the test, then you have a good baseline. So now you know without the errors, if the results are different run to run, that something else is the problem. And then just unrealistic tests are not useful. I don't want to belabor that point too much, but you're not going to have 100 users generating a large report at the same time. If that happened, Jama's going to have problems. So you're going to overload the system generating all those reports. So it might be interesting to know, but it's not going to give you the information. If your users aren't generating reports, testing a bunch of reports is just going to tell you there's problems. So I covered this. Best results are we know with no errors. And so then the final little bit of advice is you want to run your test multiple times without changing anything. So you should be able to run your test back to back and get the same results. So if I read all the items in a project, so I do like the get project ID 47, and it takes 2,000 milliseconds. The next time it should take about 2,000 milliseconds. If you start having wildly different results, that means there's something wrong with your test. So maybe you've got artificial pauses or your tests are too close together. But if you can't get the same results without changing Jama, without making any change to the system, then you're not going to have comparable results when you do change something. So if you add more memory or take memory away, or you add more, a new version of Jama, if you can't get the same results on the previous version of Jama, then what are you going to do a compare against? So, go slow, make sure that's working. This is our final Q&A. Anything else, Chloe?
Let me check, Michael. Okay. Yes, one question. What do I do if I can't get my test to produce the same results each time they're run?
Okay, so the question is, what if I can't get my tests? So you've told me to write all these tests, and I'm running them back to back, and I just can't get them to get the same result. Typically, that means you've bitten off more. You've built something pretty complex up front. So what I tell people is maybe set that aside and then start very simply. So make a single test that gets a project, or make a simple get test, and then run that back to back. So if you start simple, you can eliminate, is this a Jama problem or maybe a problem with the tool? Some tools have like artificial, they'll inject artificial pauses, and those might show up. Or you might have a setting on your tool that injects, randomization between the calls. You want to make sure that's off. Once you get a simple call running back to back, then you can stack on a few more calls, running back to back, make sure the results are there. And then you can start building your workflows. If you jump into something really complex where you might have, 50 users jumping in, moving items around, working in different projects, clicking off a report, one of the things to be aware of with Jama is other users can impact, users can impact other users. So if you have 100 users who are creating items, and then you throw one user in to generate a report in the project that the user created items, they're going to, slow a couple of those users down. And the slowdown might happen in a way that you just don't expect. Like, maybe it took longer the first time to calculate all the items to start the report. Maybe the next time it calculated them faster because it was cached. So you got to kind of look at the interaction. So lower number of users, add the test, and then start ramping up users, and then comparing them. And you can always reach out to your technical account manager, or reach out to Jama, the support community, like if you're really getting a place where you're stuck.
I have another question. Let me read it totality. When we update our Jama environment, we focus on our workflows. We do not automate tests, but let our users test our workflows in a defined time frame with a copy of the current production data. We experience 5 to 10 issues we report to Jama with every release. which I would not expect to be found on a performance test, but in a functional test. So I'd be interested in how Jama runs the functional test and regression test.
Sure. So we have an automated test suite that runs through all of the main areas. So for our regression retest each release, our focus is on making sure that existing functionality, the core critical product scenarios, the critical workflows, don't break. There are defects that people might run into. Um, Typically, those are handled by the team. So the feature teams I discussed are actually working on a specific area or a new feature. Um, what might happen is that you're running into defects that have already existed when you've upgraded, or maybe that you didn't run into before. Typically, new defects don't appear in areas that we're not working on. There's some isolation there. If it does happen, we can run those tests. I don't know on the community side if they actually have a list of known issues we can look at, and then looking at the release notes. Because if there are new bugs that we discover that we don't log or we don't fix, they are put into the release notes. But yeah, we have a functional automation suite, and then we also have the ad hoc testing that we go through each of the areas with the user and create, looking for defects. But it's not just the performance testing that we do. We do have a full automation suite, and those results are also put into the JBK. So if you have concerns about what's being tested, and like maybe you have a workflow that you think's not getting tested enough, or that's critical to your company, talk to account manager. They can get to us, and we can look and see what maybe there's a gap in our coverage. I'd be interested maybe offline knowing what those issues are. So maybe I'll follow up with Chloe on that.
Thank you, Michael. I'm checking again, see if there's any more questions in the community. I think we're good.
Okay.
That's so much great information. Thank you so much for your time. And now, without further ado, here is Emerald Wrestler to talk to us about our Enterprise Elite programs.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Hi, everyone. As Michael mentioned, my name's Emerald Wrestler. I'm a technical account manager here at Jama Software. And I just want to take a couple minutes to talk about our Elite Support Program. So the Elite Support Program offers a dedicated technical point of contact to help you through any technical projects or challenges that you're running into. So I won't highlight all of the benefits of the Elite Support Program, but I'll talk about some that are relevant to the discussion we just had. So probably the biggest one is with the Elite Support Program, you get access to a QA expert like Michael, whether or doing your initial start of a performance management program or actually after you've already begun it and you're running into questions and issues. So I'll give you a couple examples of what that engagement looks like. So on one example, we had an existing customer who really wanted to start working on performance management. And so we met with them, installed a similar program that we use to test in-house, and got them set up with some existing test scripts that were pre-written to get them off the ground quickly. And then after they started using it, we can start adding more and more test cases and analyzing the results in detail. So that's one example. Another example for customers who already have a test suite running and they run into issues, say when they're doing a performance test prior to upgrading and they notice, hey, why is the application slower? So we actually met with the customer, myself, and Michael, went through their test plan in detail and identified several issues that they can modify to improve their performance results. So this program is really focused on the unique needs of customers with either standard or non-standard data sets. Customers who are large in size, have multiple customer groups within the United States or in multiple geographies. So go to the next slide here. I'll just touch on a couple of these real quick. So with the Elite Support Program, you get like I said, a dedicated technical account manager. My job is really to ensure your success in using the application. I want to ensure that your application is stable and performant and you can continue using Jama for years to come. So it actually comes with some flexible consultation hours as well. These are really helpful for when you're designing custom reports, need help developing some API solutions, or really anything under the sun. These flexible hours can help address those. So when you're ready to do an upgrade, it can be a little bit challenging designing and ensuring that your upgrade goes smoothly prior to the actual upgrade. With this program, we offer a dedicated technical consultant who's going to stand with you and work and guide you through the upgrade from start to finish. You also have the technical account manager there overseeing everything from start to finish. So here are, the high-level benefits. I won't go through all these, but really what it's designed to do is to ensure operational success and adoption through usage scenario workshops and one-on-one meetings once a week or once a month, whatever makes the most sense for you. So we have a ton more information available below in the data sheet. So I recommend reaching out to your account manager, taking a look at the data sheet, and let us know if you have any questions. All right, with that, I'll end. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Emerald.
Okay,
I'll
you
take
bet.
it from here. In conclusion, once again, we want to thank you for joining us for our very first community deep dive. We want to hear your feedback, both good feedback and not so good feedback. Please drop me a line, Chloe Elliott, via community@jamasoftware.com. A few logistics about this first community deep dive. One, the performance planning and testing white paper and the elite support program data sheet Michael and Emerald referred to during the presentation are linked within this landing page. Two, any questions we could not get to during this event, we will do our best to answer for you on the community in a timely fashion after the event. Three, if you have any notes for any of the presenters, I'll make sure to pass it on. Ping me on the community. Four, additionally, we hope that this is the first of many live community events, so please let me know if there are any topics you'd like us to cover in the future. That's all for now. I'll see you in the community.